for racial, gender, and social justice. John and his wife retired to San Francisco, where he completed his last pastorate just recently in 2017, where their older daughter and family live. They came out to Boston for Christmas and to welcome their newest grandchild to the family that his daughter and wife had, 4-year-old Layla, who has just been adopted. He's on a book tour in this area and then headed on to New York City and Princeton, Philadelphia, Rochester, New York, and ending on Martin Luther King Day. So there's so much more that we could say, but most of all, welcome. Thank you so much for being here.
Well, thank all of you for coming, and thank you, Rebecca. This has been the best prepared book talk that I have had thus far. I was in Concord on Sunday evening and managed to avoid being stoned by the Chamber of Commerce over the major thesis of this book, which is that the Transcendentalists were, newsflash, not centered in Concord. In fact, they were much more urban. They were much less individualistic. They were much more church people than most folks recognize, because most of us get introduced to the Transcendentalists in high school or college when we're in a literature class and we read, well, Walden. Now, the most read American book from before the Civil War because it's easier than Moby Dick. Or Emerson, where we get a few poems and essays, usually self-reliance. And we may know about the Alcotts in Concord. But in effect, these were the most individualistic members of the circle. Emerson was without question their public spokesperson on the basis of his great oration at Harvard for the Phi Beta Kappa Society, the American Scholar, and then his Divinity School address. But none of the Transcendentalists thought he was the leader, or that they revolved around him. In fact, if there is a real center to the Transcendentalist movement, it's probably in downtown Boston. And the next time you're anywhere near the Common, I invite you to wander off toward Washington Street on West Street and find the shell of the building that belonged to Elizabeth Peabody and her family, where she had her bookstore with the latest in foreign literature, especially the Germans, who were of particular interest to the Transcendentalists, and where they all gathered to exchange ideas, and where Margaret Fuller conducted her famous Conversations for Women. It's a shrine. My friend Megan Marshall, who wrote the Peabody Sisters and the biography of Margaret Fuller, and I helped to get it set aside so that at least the shell is preserved as a landmark, despite the fact that it keeps becoming one after another really bad restaurant. I think I should focus a little bit on the connections with Transcendentalism right here in this church and in this town. Because I would be remiss if I didn't lift up, among the many neglected Transcendentalists of the first, second, and third generations, and there was more than one, and I would claim we're the inheritors. We're the present generation of Transcendentalists. Thomas Wentworth Higginson, who in the late 1840s occupied that wonderful pulpit for a relatively brief time, until he gave that infamous Thanksgiving sermon in which he basically said to the people sitting in the pews, many of whom were prosperous ship owners in this town and merchants, "You should be grateful, but not for the way in which your wealth was built on exploitation and connections with the cotton trade, the textile industry, and the continuation of slavery." He stayed in the area, you know, and ran for Congress on the Free Soil ticket. I tried to lift up people like Higginson in this book because he's not been either terribly well remembered or understood. There are some decent biographies of him. I understand that another scholar, a friend of Megan's and mine, is at work at a new biography of Higginson. But here's a couple of things that I figured out and that you'll find in my book. I have a whole chapter entitled Marriage in the 19th Century. If you think marriage today is tough, in the strictures of the Victorian era, in an era when women didn't have the right to divorce or escape from domestic abuse or the right to own property, much less vote, oh my God. And there are several examples of how these marriages were hard not only on the women but also on their partners. Higginson was married to Mary Channing, William Ellery Channing's niece. She was the daughter of his brother Walter, who was Boston's leading obstetrician and the first dean of Harvard Medical School. Higginson had more interest in her than he did in the ministry. In fact, there's some reason to believe that the only reason that he went back to divinity school after having dropped out was that he knew that Walter wouldn't allow him to marry Mary unless he had a profession ahead of him. And their pastor at the first Transcendentalist congregation in Boston, the Church of the Disciples, headed by James Freeman Clark, sort of redeemed the hope that Higginson had for the ministry when Clark pulled together 170-some Unitarian ministers in a petition to the Congress condemning slavery. Most of the churches were silent on the subject. After all, the wealthy parishioners who supported them were almost entirely tied up with some aspect of the financing of the mills and the cotton trade. It was bad for business. Well, at the age of 15, Mary Channing Higginson was present when her stepmother, her own mother died when she was about 5, and after about a decade, her father remarried. Her stepmother, Barbara, who interestingly enough was a Higginson, died in childbirth, as the baby did, despite the best efforts of Walter, the leading obstetrician. I have reason to believe that one cause behind Thomas Wentworth Higginson's restless, almost reckless activism was his wife was deathly afraid of ever becoming pregnant. Think about what that does to a marriage in the 19th century. And then, although there was no diagnostic term for it then, in her 20s, it's pretty clear Mary Channing Higginson had multiple sclerosis, an illness with which I'm all too familiar because my own mother had it. I try to put background, economic, relational, social, political, to the figures that I lift up as taking the transcendentalist tradition not just into literature or into conversation, but into action. And Higginson was perhaps one of the most radical activists among them. You know, in 1854, he and the leading black abolitionist in Boston, Lewis Hayden, together held a battering ram and beat down the door of the courthouse in Boston in order to rescue the fugitive slave Anthony Buehrens. Thousands of people poured into the streets. Out of Faneuil Hall, where Theodore Parker stood up and addressed the crowd initially by saying, "My fellow citizens of Virginia," pointing out to Bostonians and citizens of Massachusetts that the fugitive slave law had extended the reach of the slaveocracy into this part of the world. Higginson went on also to become, before the 54th Massachusetts Volunteers with Robert Gould Shaw, he was the first colonel of a black regiment, the first South Carolina Volunteers, gathered from among the freed slaves of the Sea Islands in South Carolina that were captured by the Union forces relatively early in the war. His best book is called Life in a Black Regiment. It's a remarkable story of a privileged white leader actually listening to his African American troops and learning from them. There's another piece of evidence in that Barbara Owen and I were discussing over dinner a little while ago. He listened to them singing around the campground, the campfires in the evening, and was the first white person to actually take down the lyrics and appreciate the spirituals and bring them into the mainstream of American culture. Think what a contribution that is. Because of Mary's disability, Higginson had been very frustrated in 1860. He wanted to extend his abolitionism into serving in the military in some way, but he knew that his wife needed him. It wasn't until he realized that she had a niece who might come and take care of her that he was willing to actually enlist and end up in South Carolina. Just to give you a sense of how interrelated some of these transcendentalists were, Mary Channing's brother, Ellery, actually William Ellery Channing II, sometimes called Channing of Concord, was married to Margaret Fuller's sister. And their daughter, Margaret Fuller Channing, came to take care of Mary Channing Higginson when her husband went off to war. Ellery was one of these people who proved to be a disappointment to his wife. He never could provide a decent living. He wanted to be a poet, but even Thoreau dubbed his verse sublimo slipshod. And at the end of things, he and Ellen Kershaw Fuller actually separated over his inability to provide. Women had many reasons to worry about getting married in the 19th century. If you read Megan Marshall's biography of the Peabody sisters, you get a vivid story of why Elizabeth Peabody was always busy marrying somebody else but never married herself. She knew about the abuse of women in the previous generations of her family. She actually got engaged quietly, first to Horace Mann, before she handed him off to her sister Mary, and then to Sophia Peabody, to Nathaniel Hawthorne, whom she handed off to her youngest sister, Sophia. By the way, all of those weddings were done by the same fellow, James Freeman Clarke, who married Higginson to Mary Channing. He's the thread figure in my book, the one who seems to have been a friend to everybody. And one of the most important things about this group of people is the way in which they found spiritual friendship to be a spiritual discipline. sticking with one another through thick and thin. One of the best examples is Clark's friendship with Margaret Fuller. When they were 20 years old, they were studying German together, which actually was a pretty intimate thing for a man and a woman to be doing. Fuller was tremendously smart and well-educated. Her father was a lawyer and a congressman, but she held court with Harvard students in Cambridge. And I discovered in the archives of Harvard Clark's journal of his meetings with Margaret, who clearly scared him to death. It's like a verbatim. Those of us who've trained for the ministry go to clinical pastoral education and are expected to turn in verbatim reports of our conversations with patients in the hospital or wherever. And Clark's verbatim about his early flirtation with Margaret Fuller begins, J. I hesitate to come to you when I have no fresh ideas to share. M. What makes you think I'm interested in your ideas? And yet Margaret Fuller, I think, figured out, as did James, that probably being a minister's wife in that era was not the highest and best use of her gifts. And that was what the Transcendentalists were concerned about. If there was a transcendent imperative that they absorbed from the German idealists and from Kant, it's that I cannot treat you as just an object of my utility or convenience. The categorical imperative is that I recognize that you, like me, are a spiritual being, a moral agent. My fuller flourishing as a human being in the spiritual and moral dimension is tied up with whether I care about you. And I'm stretched by my encounter with you. That we really care about not only one another, but what can we do together that might actually impact even people beyond us and make this a better world. Now, where the dickens did these people get that? Well, I think there were multiple sources. You couldn't go into the ministry back then at Harvard without being literate in both Latin and Greek. I think they all read Cicero de Amicitia. But more importantly, they grew up in churches like this one, where people came together on the basis of covenantal commitment to one another's spiritual growth, not on the basis of a creed. Not only that, they saw these congregations as being devoted not just to their internal membership and spiritual growth of people in the pews, but the quality of community life in the whole community around. It's what the old first parishes and first religious societies were all about in mission. And the Transcendentalists, I think, as a rebel generation in these old New England churches, did a remarkable job of rekindling a fire that their grandparents had expressed about democracy in starting the American Revolution. Almost to a person, the Transcendentalists were grandchildren of revolutionaries. Emerson's grandfather watched the revolution break out as the minister in Concord from the windows of the old manse looking over the Old North Bridge. Parker, Theodore Parker, who's one of Clark's closest friends, and among the most radical, like Higginson of the Transcendentalists. His grandfather was Captain John Parker of Lexington, who led the Minutemen on the Battle Green. Parker held onto his musket and the one that he had captured from a British soldier, and just before the Civil War, presented them to the Commonwealth, and they were held up by Governor Andrew, a parishioner of Clark's, as symbols of why we were going to have to use force to fight slavery. Let me say a bit about Theodore Parker while he's on my mind. Tomorrow night I speak at First Parish in Lexington, where he grew up, and where I began my student ministry 50 years ago, under a portrait of Theodore Parker. He was so eloquent in his ministry in Boston, which never would have been established without his friend Clark, that two of the most hallowed phrases in American democracy really can be traced back to him. He's the source of the phrase, government of the people, by the people, for the people. Lincoln got it via his Unitarian law partner in Springfield, who was devoted to Parker's writing and preaching, and used it in the Gettysburg Address. Parker's the source of the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends toward justice. Martin Luther King got it, I've now determined, from a man named John Haynes Holmes, a Unitarian minister in New York City, in whose pulpit I'll be on Sunday morning, who was the grandson of the treasurer of Parker's church in Boston, John Haynes. And he published it in The Crisis, the organ of the NAACP, which John Haynes Holmes co-founded with W.E.B. Du Bois. Now, remember I mentioned Higginson and Lewis Hayden, Boston's leading black abolitionists, beating down the courthouse door together? One of the most remarkable things about this network of spiritual friendship, this discipline of spiritual friendship, is how often these transcendentalists transcended differences not only in age, gender, social location, theology. Parker and Clark didn't agree about theology at all, but also race. One of my other discoveries in the book, which I wrote about in an article in our denominational magazine in the fall, I came across last winter when I was in Florence, Italy. That's where Parker died in 1860, trying to recover from tuberculosis. He was also kind of lucky to be out of the country. He was, along with the other members of the Secret Six, which included Higginson, in some danger of being prosecuted for having supported John Brown in his attempt to start a slave insurrection at Harper's Ferry. Well, the thing that I discovered in visiting Parker's grave in the Protestant cemetery in Florence is that the monument that stands there now is not the original gravestone. It was put up in 1890 as a result of a campaign led by Frederick Douglass. In 1887, when Douglass was the most famous African American on the planet, he toured Europe and went out of his way to take the overnight train from Rome to Florence to arrive on the actual anniversary of Parker's death there. That evening, he wrote to Theodore Stanton, the son of Elizabeth Cady Stanton, the suffragist. You're right, Parker's grave is unworthy of him. It was perhaps all his widow could afford. But a man like that should have a monument that is a sermon in itself. And he and Stanton raised the funds to commission the best sculptor in Rome, William Wetmore Story, the son of Justice Joseph Story of the Supreme Court, who had ruled in favor of the Africans aboard the Amistad, to put up a marble monument that has a bust of Parker and more detail about him as the great American preacher, and ends with the remarkable inscription, "His name is here inscribed in marble, his virtues on the hearts of those whom he saved from slavery and superstition." One of the things about our present situation that I think makes my narrative relevant is that our country, God help it, has probably never been more polarized than it is now since the immediate run-up to the Civil War. The title of the book, Conflagration, comes in part from a poem that Frederick Douglass wrote in reaction to the horrible decision of the U.S. Supreme Court in the case of Dred Scott in 1857. He alludes to the spirit of the American Revolution that his white transcendentalist friends, like Parker, had introduced him to. He said that that spirit, that revolutionary spirit, has burned out, but the embers remain, and it can be and must be rekindled, but it will be with such a blast that the country, especially in the South, will go up in wild conflagration. A prophetic utterance in 1857. You know, we used to think the worst president in American history was James Buchanan. We used to. Speaking out in Concord and Lexington, I ran across some yard signs that calling for leadership. Any functioning adult, 2020. From your mouth to God's ears, this too shall pass. Parker and Douglass actually united in feeling that they needed a second American Revolution. And conflagration is, in part, an evocation of how the Civil War represented that. But as Eric Foner says in his great book about what followed the Civil War, Reconstruction, it was an unfinished revolution. We know that because racial injustice and many other forms of injustice persist. Already in the 1840s, the Transcendentalists were encountering the increasing gap between wealth and poverty. George Ripley, who was the original convener of the Transcendentalist Circle in 1836, served a congregation down at Purchase Street near where South Station stands. It was a slum. He and his wife began to hold conversations at Elizabeth Peabody's bookstore, among other places, about what are we going to do about the homeless, the women who are turning to prostitution, the drug and alcohol problems. It's all a result of this increasing disparity between wealth and poverty. They ended up becoming the founders of that relatively short-lived, but not as unsuccessful as people think, experiment called Brook Farm, which ended really in another conflagration. What ended Brook Farm was not internal failure, it was the fact that they were building a huge new building and it went up in flames. By the way, Clark purchased the property then and offered it when the Civil War broke out as a training ground for the 54th Massachusetts Volunteers. His own parishioner was John Andrew, the Civil War governor of Massachusetts, who first made use of it until the militia decided to train elsewhere. There's also the story in the book of the creation of two things that people never would associate with the Transcendentalists. Far from being individualists, they were some of the best organizers to come along during the Civil War. The Unitarian ministers with Transcendentalist backgrounds, including Thomas Starr King, the minister in the San Francisco church where I had the privilege of serving for a few years, raised the money and organized the largest humanitarian relief organization to that point in American history, the predecessor of the Red Cross, then known as the U.S. Sanitary Commission. One of the commissioners was Samuel Gridley Howe, whose wife, Julia, was again part of Clark's flock. Not a happy marriage. Howe was the founder of the Perkins School of the Blind and a rabid abolitionist, another one of the Secret Six, but he was an unreconstructed male chauvinist pig. 18 years Julia's senior, he forbade her from speaking in public or publishing anything in her own name. The latest biography of her is entitled The Civil Wars of Julia Ward Howe. I should say, by the way, that my book is tremendously indebted to some of the marvelous scholarship and biographical writing that's been done in the last 20, 25 years around some of these people in the Transcendentalist world. But I connect them in a way that nobody, I think, has ever done. And I connect them around their shared commitment to justice and their work, their successful work in that regard. The Howes went to Washington to find the 54th Massachusetts, which had been a church project of the Church of the Disciples. I discovered that, the African-American volunteers were expected to show up with all their old kit, and most of them couldn't. So the church raised the money so that they'd be equipped. Howe was also one of the Secret Six. But when he was in Washington, he was busily working on the hospitals and the inspection of the sanitary conditions of the people encamped around the Capitol. While Clark, who went with them, and John Andrew and his wife went out and visited, a Massachusetts artillery battalion that was led by a colonel who was another Unitarian Transcendentalist minister. He invited Julia to speak to his men. She gave a rousing little address because her husband wasn't present. The men applauded. John Andrews said, "You must continue to speak." The next day, she rode out with Clark and heard soldiers singing, "John Brown's body lies a-mouldering in the grave." Clark, as a pastor, knew that that must be painful to Julia because her husband had actually fled twice to Canada for fear of being prosecuted for his part in John Brown's raid. And he turned to her and said, "The men clearly love that rousing tune. It's a pity it doesn't have better words." And that night in the Willard Hotel, Julia, with her infant daughter asleep in the bed next to her, got up in the middle of the night with the first stanza of the battle hymn resonating and being set down. By the way, that should never be read as a militaristic or triumphalist hymn. It's a prayer that somehow, perhaps out of this violence, redemption can come. So I think I have expended my 30 minutes. I haven't covered the whole story. I write it like an opera. I bring on the major characters one at a time so that they can sing their piece and you can hear what they have to say about their life experience, what brought them to these active application of ideals. Then there are the duets, whether they're marital or friendships, and some big scenes, urban riots, organizational meetings. But why I did this is probably tied up with an epigraph I wanted to put somewhere in the book, stolen from that great songwriter, Billy Joel. We didn't start the fire. It was always burning since the world's been turning. Our planet's in danger. Our society's in danger. None of these folks wanted civil war. Not all of them wanted to save the natural world, which inspired them enormously. If we aren't inspired by their example in this time of danger, we're really missing something. And so I commend their stories to you as worthy of our attention. My greatest hope is that you'll read this book and then go on and read the biography of one or more of the people who are depicted. But then see them not just as a writer, not just as an individualist, but as, like you and me, people who had darn well better get out of ourselves and into friendship and into solidarity and into covenanted community that builds voluntary efforts to save what Lincoln called democracy as the last best hope of earth. It's in danger, and it needs you and me. And I thank you for your attention. So I know darn well I have left lots of stuff unanswered about the Transcendentalists, and I'm now really going to bring the mic to anybody who would like to pick up a thread or ask me anything that you care to. Don't be shy. Yes.
You've talked obviously very significantly about the way people of that era work to put their ideals into action, but you also, more than implied, indicated that they were people who found themselves in what's called a covenanted community. I think you used the phrase spiritual friendship. I'm curious, given my experience, and I'm newish to Unitarianism in this church, with the broad swath of people here, where a lot of us are sort of struggle spiritually, and we have the benefit of being in this non-creedal environment where we can do that together and be very open and honest with each other. Do you have a sense of what that looked like for the people of that era?
They were really upset with the Unitarian churches of their time. The grandparents had been revolutionaries, but their parents were so complacent that they really basically sat in the pew patting themselves on the back for being so intelligent that they didn't believe in the Trinity. It's what Emerson called pale negations. It's not a sufficient faith. These folks picked up spiritual disciplines of deep reflection. They all kept journals, examining what they'd done or left undone that day, how they were treating one another. The most remarkable thing to me is that people like Clark and Fuller wrote and said, "Would you send me your journal? I'll send you mine." Can you imagine exposing yourself that way? So there's a lot of risk-taking in the personal relationships. And they felt that the practice of discerning how you could make a greater contribution to the wider world was part of being in spiritual covenanted relationship. So in Clark's congregation, for example, every 2 weeks they held a meeting in the evening, in the midweek, not on Sunday morning, where everybody crossed class lines. They were very deeply devoted to having a congregation that was rich and poor together. Would talk about the things that troubled them in the world that they were feeling prayerful about. And then as a group, they would discern what they could do. One of the first things they did, this blows me away, was that they realized that women were fleeing domestic violence and needed a place to go. They started the first sanctuary for women in that condition in the city of Boston. A little later, as they became more deeply engaged with the city's African American population, Clark's own mother became the superintendent of a home for aged African American women who, after they couldn't work any longer, there was no Social Security, and there were not sufficient resources within the African American community to provide decently for the elderly. So here's another thing. I think people who practice our free faith today responsibly do continuous discernment about how we can be engaged in the needs of the world. And we find support for that within the life of our congregations. Jim Adams, who was the great ethicist and theologian of the last generation, of the 20th century, used to say that every Unitarian Universalist should be involved in one organization outside the church that is dealing with life and death issues, and where you not only contribute, but you actually go to the meetings, and you stay to the end, and you get involved in the nitty-gritty of the strategy and the tactics. For the decade between 2002 and 2012, I had the privilege of being national co-chair of Freedom to Marry. When I started, I was the only non-gay person in the room and the only religious leader. But what I said was, I think LGBT people have more allies in the religious world than they know, and I am committed to making sure that they get on board. It worked. It was probably the most successful civil rights campaign of our time. We can do these things, but we have to get out of ourselves and in significant ways get out of our comfort zone.
You're talking about civil rights, and as long as I've been around Unitarians, they've always been aware of going from antebellum times to be abolitionist till now to believe in all the right causes. My question to you is, why has Unitarian Universalism failed so miserably to incorporate our brown and black brothers and sisters?
One of the things that history shows is that periods of advance in human rights and conflict over these issues are almost invariably followed by periods of regression. This is true following the Civil War with that failed Reconstruction. And the fatigue after the Civil War led Northerners all across the spectrum to just give up on trying to continue to fight with the South over civil rights for African Americans. There was an abandonment. That happened. I'm a product of the year 1947. Another period after war, like the 1920s after World War I, when American culture became very self-indulgent, complacent. I started in the ministry in 1973 in a congregation in Knoxville, Tennessee, that was started the year I was born as the only integrated congregation of any sort in that city. It had every African American leader in the city in the congregation in that period. By the 1970s, black nationalism called all of those black leaders back into the black church. And white America was busily indulging itself in what pundits called the me decade. Busily picking our individual spiritual navel lint instead of being engaged in effective stretching out toward others. I suppose there's a kind of rhythm here. It's kind of 2 steps forward, 1 step back. But as far as treating ourselves as a failure on the issue of inclusion, I would just argue with that. When I was president, I kept across from my desk the photograph of the Reverend Louis McGee, who in 1954, when Brown versus Board of Education came down, was the only African-American Unitarian minister serving a congregation. One. How many years ago was it? 5? That we had the 50th anniversary of Selma. Yeah, 2015. 50 years since 1965, and John Lewis on the bridge, and the death of one of our white ministers in Selma. And I went because I thought that was one of the great moments in modern Unitarian catalyzing of interfaith response to rally around Dr. King. Over half of the of the ministers who showed up to support King in Selma were Unitarian ministers. But what pleased me on the 50th anniversary was that there were 100 Unitarian ministers of color who came to that anniversary event. We now have more diversity in our movement than we've ever had previously. It always will be a gradual evolution, but we mustn't treat ourselves as failures. We have to treat ourselves as in process. One of the last chapters of the book is called Evolution and Differentiation, and it's about the positive reception of Darwin by the Transcendentalists, even in 1859. Among other things, they thought that Darwin proved that we all come from one common ancestor, and therefore are all sisters and brothers, and need to treat one another that way. But the chapter goes on to talk about differentiation, which is an evolutionary truth. People differentiate in a whole variety of ways. Sadly, the women's rights movement, right after the Civil War, divided over race. I found it amazing that Frederick Douglass was writing to Elizabeth Cady Stanton's son, Theodore, because Stanton took the American women's rights movement into a completely racist posture by refusing to support the 14th and 15th Amendments and literally saying, is Sambo going to get to vote before educated women do? The history of the women's rights movement was set back for a generation or more. And one of the things I learned through the great scholar Lisa Tetreault was that during the period when the Boston women were hanging in with the advance of the suffrage to African American males, Stanton and Susan B. Anthony sort of seized control of the history and began the first project of recording the history of women's rights in America, and wrote Margaret Fuller out of the story, and wrote Lucy Stone and all of the Boston transcendentalist abolitionist women out of the story. We have to correct some of the history. There is failure. We have to admit it. But we mustn't say, on the basis of even betrayals of the ideals, that the effort itself is a failure. And in fact, I would say that ours has been the one historic religious movement with covenanted communities that has often been able to step forward, whether it's been at Selma or in the Freedom to Marry movement, ahead of others. Not that we're all that numerous or all that magical, but that we can catalyze people because we're willing to transcend differences at our best. When we become narcissistic, we're useless. But that's true all across the spectrum in our culture. Sadly, we are in a culture shaped by individualistic consumerism and narcissism to a greater degree than I've ever experienced, and we have to overcome that. We're going to have to get some people who aren't just guys here.
Do you think that capitalism is destroying democracy?
In part. Certainly, anybody who has any intelligent sense of how to manage a market economy knows that it has to have rules of fairness. And we have completely neglected providing buffers and by the way, this is one of the things that was not well understood in the 19th century. After the Civil War, one of the things that happened was a almost magical belief in the market. And it led to corruption, and we're back in it. So we need to have degrees of buffering for those who are left out in the whole midst. Now, a female interlocutor.
Well, thanks so much for your amazing talk. I've always thought about the Transcendentalists in connection with how they were inspired by nature, and you alluded to that very briefly, and I'm sure it's a book unto itself. But I'd love it if you would share one or two of their spiritual practices. But I have a follow-on question, which is how do you imagine that our 19th century Transcendentalist forebears would be responding to today's crisis with respect to climate change?
It's one reason I acceded to the title Conflagration. As I said, the planet's burning. On the 22nd of April, I'll be in Madison, Wisconsin, lecturing on the 50th anniversary of Earth Day. And what I want to do there, it was started by Senator Gaylord Nelson of Wisconsin in April of 1970. I want to go back to Emerson's first book, Nature, and Thoreau. Toward the end of my book, I have this scene where an aging Emerson comes to California. He preaches in the San Francisco church where I preached. The only thing they remembered about it was he knocked over the flowers. But then he went up to Yosemite, which Thomas Starr King helped to save. There's a mountain named for him there. And he spent an entire day with John Muir, who had become an Emersonian when he studied with a Unitarian professor at the University of Wisconsin before going to the West. And he, of course, picked up Thoreau's phrase, "In wildness is the preservation of the world," for the Sierra Club. Well, I remember entering the Unitarian ministry in Knoxville, Tennessee in 1973, and one of my congregants, Will Skelton, a lawyer who was Howard Baker's law partner, was the president of the Sierra Club. In the previous 2 years, there had been an Earth Day observed in Knoxville at the university as a teach-in. But in 1973, the Sierra Club and the Unitarian Church took it out in public and got everybody on board. I'm going to challenge some scholar to trace how Sierra Club chapters and Unitarian churches spread the Earth Day celebrations and the awareness of the danger that we were beginning to face. So I know how our Transcendentalist forebears would have reacted to climate change. They would not have despaired. They would have acted. Because their faith, frankly, was transcendent. It was not easily set back by even the worst of public decisions. They didn't stop when the Dred Scott decision came down. They didn't stop when the fugitive slave law passed. They didn't stop when Emerson wrote in his journal about the latter, "This filthy enactment was penned by human beings in the 19th century who can read and write, but I will not obey it, by God." They resisted, and so must we, as best we can, for our own sake and for the generations that will follow us, because, as I said, we are the present generation of the Transcendentalists. Any of us who have any appreciation of there being other faith traditions beyond the deep taproot in the biblical tradition that they drew upon, but also transcended by reading the Vedas and exploring Buddhism, and Clark ends up as the first professor of comparative religion in the country at Harvard after writing a great book that went through 22 editions called 10 Great Religions. We need to build bridges. We need to work across differences in background and religion and the like, and especially around our shared stewardship of the one common, amazing home that we've been given to live in. They were awed by nature. They saw it as the visible manifestation of the divine. And until we begin to appreciate it again as an unmerited gift, and not just something to be mined and exploited and paved over, will we have anything resembling their spirit about how to live in this world.
Thank you for being here. My understanding is that the Transcendentalist views of indigenous people was not quite as enlightened or progressive as their other views. Can you talk about that?
So, by the time they come along, there are almost no indigenous people left in most of Massachusetts. And you're right that Thoreau sort of writes nostalgically about the Native American population when he writes in Walden. He built a cabin modeled on a cabin that had been built by an African-American servant who was supposedly freed at the end of the Revolution. Read a book called Black Walden. But the other remarkable person on Native American rights during this period is Lydia Mariah Child, whose brother was the first moderator of the Transcendentalist Ministers Group. She becomes the editor of the Anti-Slavery Journal in New York City. But her first book, Hubbamook, which she wrote in her 20s, was a kind of a response to James Fenimore Cooper's Last of the Mohicans. It's a story about a Native American who ends up in an interracial marriage. It's a stunning book with a real reverence for the remaining. She lived up in Maine for a while among Native people and honored them. They also were very much involved in gathering signatures to oppose the Cherokee removal. Emerson himself wrote on that subject. So they were not completely obtuse to what had been done with the indigenous population. It's just that so little of it was left. After all, the colonization process here in New England had been going on for 2 centuries by the time they come along. And I could go on and on about that. One of the things we're doing in the denomination this year is a common read of a remarkable book called An Indigenous People's History of the United States. And I have to admit that if I had thoroughly absorbed all of that perspective, I might have had an even deeper lens on some of their anti-oppression work in writing what I did. But thank you for raising that issue. Maybe one or two, oh, Stites. Yeah. So I'm going to say a word about this man first. When I hired him to be the director of communications for the Unitarian Universalist Association, after he'd had a distinguished career doing things like starting Jazz Magazine and being national news editor for the New York Times, I told him that I was worried that we couldn't possibly pay him what he'd been used to making. He said not to worry, that Alex was okay with it. And then he said, and besides, you're giving me the title that I've always wanted all my life. And I said, Director of Communications for the Unitarian Universalist Association, that's the title you've wanted? He said, no, the one that goes with the magazine that I'll be in charge of. Editor-in-Chief of the World.
Thank you, John. The notion of religious friendship, spiritual friendship, excuse me, it has a grip on me, and I'm wondering how you have encountered it, or if you've encountered it at all, in any of our congregations in the present time. And if you have, could you tell us a story? And if you haven't, do you have an imagination of how this could be done now?
Well, I think when I was president of the association, one of the things I figured out was that all of the local pastors needed a friend. And that I was, if there was anything I was really called to, it was to be minister to my colleagues as best I could. And all along the way, I've been ministered to by others. The other night, or the last Sunday, I preached in the pulpit of my buddy John Gibbons. And I just rang the changes on how influential he's been in the life of my family. When my dad died, I couldn't do the memorial service, John did it. When my daughter got married under a chuppah to a nice Jewish boy, it was a rabbi who presided, but she wanted John there to represent the Unitarian tradition. When my daughter married her wife Anna in my wife's Episcopal church, John co-officiated not only at the wedding, but at communion for everybody, the Episcopalians, the Filipino Catholics, the Unitarians. And when my mother died, he was the chaplain, and he knows that if a bus hits me, he gets to do my service. We all need spiritual friends. We all need to be spiritual friends. The circles widen, you know. The wider they are, the thinner the friendship is. I have 3,286 friends on Facebook, about half of whom I think I've met. We need to deepen what it means to be a friend. But I think we do that in our congregations through things like small group ministry. At the General Assembly, I'm going to be doing a dialogue with a member of the San Francisco congregation that came into the church during my time as minister. Her name is Rochelle Fortia Nwadibia. Among other things, she was the Human Rights Commissioner of the state of Missouri for a while. She's an immigration attorney, born in Martinique in the Caribbean. Her late husband was Nigerian. Rochelle and I are spiritual friends. We've had an influence on one another. We've been there for one another. And this is across some significant differences. She's now the vice moderator of the congregation. So I think we know how to do this. The reason I lift up the concept is I think the challenge of doing it needs words. And we also need to realize how much we can be enriched by having spiritual friendships that transcend difference. So part of my challenge to people in our congregation, I've been preaching in New York on Sunday, the title is Spiritual Friendship and Social Justice. Every single social justice cause in American history has been fueled by people transcending differences. Among other things, the successful ones usually bridge the gap between religious leadership and secular leadership. Dan McCannon, who wrote one of the blurbs in my book, has this book called Prophetic Encounters, about how religious and secular leaders, I found that to be true in the Freedom to Marry movement. Many of the gay lesbian people were so alienated from anything resembling religion that they considered themselves entirely secular, but they were amazed at how much risk religious leaders were willing to take to stand up for human rights. And that continues, of course, to be in some communions like our friends and our sisters and brothers in the United Methodist Church who are disuniting over it, that a challenge. So friendship has to be aimed at something. Even Cicero said, only people who aim at the good can truly be friends to one another. So there's no honor among thieves. Those who have less than noble purposes for engaging with others, that's not real friendship. That's a pseudo cabal of one sort or another. You see a lot of it in business and in politics. Real friendship is devoted to something bigger than yourself that you share with the other. Marriage is a lot that way, right? Okay, maybe one more. Then we got to sell books and get out of here.
Some of us in the community here are reading the book God of the Becoming. What's been said about spiritual friendship and coming together in the broader context of the recurring institutional and societal struggles, all right? And maybe the expectations that one may have given their effort to be active and involved. I think covenant and spiritual friendship takes on a different dimension where despite what may be achieved, and you might be thinking that you're not really reaching, right? There's at least a basis for coming together and being affirmed. So maybe you can comment on that?
Well, I think frustration and failure can actually be occasion for deepening of spiritual friendship and commitment to one another. I think of Clark and Fuller again. Clark goes out to Louisville, Kentucky, as the first Unitarian minister west of the Appalachians, and he's expected to preach without notes, and he's been carefully trained at Harvard to have a manuscript. And the first time he tries preaching without notes, he writes to Margaret that the courage just poured out the ends of his fingers, and he watched a whole group of women get up in the back of the church and leave. And he's not sure he can last. And she writes back to him and says, "Oh, yes, you can. And here are a few sermon ideas." He starts, then, the first Transcendentalist journal. Before the Dial, which Margaret later edited, it's called The Western Messenger. And he asks her, would you review that new book? Her first essays are published by him. The encouragement that people gave one another, even in the face of feeling like failures, was just amazing to me. And a lot of the failures were political or organizational. But they persisted with one another in ways that I think are truly inspirational. So again, people think faith is tied up with belief. Baloney. Even the most atheistic and agnostic have a form of faith that is required just to put one foot in front of the other and live tomorrow. So faithful living, as Sartre, the good atheist, knew, is a matter of integrity, and it's demonstrated in relationship. And none of us do it very well alone. When we think we can do it alone, we delude ourselves and are usually in the position of patting ourselves on the back for our self-reliance. That kind of pride is the enemy of authentic friendship. We need one another. And so I thank you for being my friends tonight and welcoming me in this wonderful and historic place. And I charge you, try to be the kind of deeply devoted friend to someone in the days ahead, thinking about the example of people who did it years before in the face of greater challenges than we face even today. Because another form of pride is to believe that ours is the worst of all possible times. Baloney. We have transcended and accomplished much, even in this imperfect union called America. And we can do more. We must do more. But it starts with us. Thank you. Can't even turn this off. My incompetence is showing. I can't even turn it off.